The next series we're going to talk about in the conbraco world is the 4S100 series, also known as the DC or DC4S series like this, produced in sizes half all the way up through 10-inch. The small half-inch was a standalone size. The 2.5 through 10 were produced in the flange sizes, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Anyway, production began around 1998 on this particular 4S design. I'll talk about this in the different size ranges. The half-inch 4S series looks like this. It was a modular construction, single cover from the top. The cover unscrews from the top, exposes a retainer. The two check assemblies come out in one piece like that. The check assemblies were not field repairable, and you replace the entire check assembly for the repair of that particular assembly. This was only produced in half-inch, and it was used mainly as a bypass valve on their double check detector assemblies. But it was sold as a plain double check when the need for half-inch double check was sold. But like I say, a lot of them were sold as put on bypasses for backflow assemblies. In the larger sizes, 2.5 through 10, we had a ductile iron body that was fused epoxy coated. We had two access covers pointing up in the top. Here's the 2.5 through 6. Here's the 8 through 10. Main difference visually on the outside was that the 8 through 10-inch covers on the top, there's a spring under there. The spring retainer knob was at an angle like this, where the 2.5 through 6, that retainer was pointing straight up like you see here in this picture. The 2.5 through 6-inch utilized a glass-filled Naril plastic check assembly. Here's the body, ductile iron body that's fused epoxy coated. The check assembly was sealed by an O-ring inside the body, held in with a gasket and a cover on the top. The cover slipped over this piece here, which is a spring retainer knob, and the spring knob was what lined up that cover so that it lined up with the bolt holes. When the check assembly was properly inserted into the body and the O-ring was pushed all the way over to this slot here, only then would the cover go on. So the cover kind of acted like a guide for the check assemblies, putting them in. On the outside of the body, there is this piece up here, this number 1, this spring cap, and that had to be unscrewed for the repair. In other words, you shut the water off, drain the water out of the body. To disassemble, you'd have to remove this spring cap first and then take your cover bolts off, taking the cover off and the gasket, which would expose the check assembly, which can now be pulled out of the check assembly. The 8 through 10-inch was a little different, that the disc holders were made of brass rather than the plastic, but same basic construction where the cover had to come off from the top, which had that spring cap in it, and the spring stayed up into that cover, and the check assembly came out in one piece for the repair like this. There was also a double check detector assembly. This was known as the 4S600 series double check assembly. You can see the basic 4S100 main valve, obviously with different spring loads, and the bypass piped up here like this. So the 4S100, the 4S600 is the double check detector assembly. The 4S100 is the double check assembly. Let's go ahead and take it apart and see what it looks like. Let's go ahead and take the half-inch apart first. Check cover will unscrew from the top, O-ring seal. We see here the O-ring cover. O-ring comes with the lubricant, so again, you don't have to worry about buying lube. It comes with the particular assembly. Once we see the cover off the top, we'll see that there's a single access to both checks. And if you look closely inside here, you're going to see this piece right here. The retainer is what holds those two checks in the body. And it's very important how that retainer holds those checks, because that's what gives that backflow assembly its stability. The retainer pulls straight up like this, and you'll see that it's just a piece of stamped stainless steel. What you're looking at inside that body is this. You're seeing your second check like this, your first check sitting in here just like that inside there. So the function of this retainer is to hold this first check in place like that, and second check in the body like this. Why is that important? Well, anytime you have an inline check design, you want as much stability on that check movement as you can get. Remember earlier we talked about that third of a relationship between the rise of the check seat and the thickness of the check disc. It's important that we know that that causes that disc compression, but you can also simulate disc compression by the actual movement of the check assembly. In other words, if this was backed off this far, and as soon as you put back pressure on the second check it moved that far, it's going to cause a tremendous disc compression problem with the assembly. So that retainer is critical, how it sits inside the body, holds it first check and second check in there just like that. So let's go ahead and remove our retainer like this. What that allows, the first check comes out first, second check has to come out second. Now, to remove that first check, we have to unthread it out of the disc holder. And what you're going to do is just get in with your fingers and move it. It will come off very easily, turns easily through there, and comes out. There are no threads on the check assembly, but there's these small little ears on the side right there. And these ears are what's holding that check assembly into the body. And if you see this ear right there, one here, one on that side, there are 4. So putting it back in the body is why those ears are important to know. We'll talk about that in a second. Second check, what we're going to do is grab right here and pull out on the second check chassis. Once the piece comes out in one piece, you'll notice the check assembly comes out in one piece like this, sealed by an O-ring, which you see right in there, and check assembly comes out. The check assemblies are not field repairable, so when you get a repair kit for this, you're going to get a new second check module like this and a new first check module. Now, once you've got the check assemblies out and we're ready to put them back in, the first check, which has those little ears that we discussed, has to go into the body, and what happens is as you push it in, you start tightening it, or start threading it. And that threading, like as if it had a pipe thread, those little ears will suddenly start grabbing the little recesses right here. And that causes that first check to go in place. Once that's in place, it allows you to put the second check in, move it over, and go ahead and put our retainer on, and the check assemblies will look like that inside the body. So that's our 4S100 series in the 1/2-inch size. We're talking about the conbraco 4S series, also known as the DC series of backflow assemblies, 4S-600, the DCDA, but I want to talk about that in the 100 series, which is the double check. But I wanted to show you the body because this is what you're going to see. Obviously, we have our fire alarm hooked up here. The thing I wanted to show you is this piece right here, and this knob literally unscrews off of there. The check assembly sits inside the body just like this, sealed by an O-ring inside, and the knob protrudes to the top of the check cover. That spring knob goes over the top, has a gasket on there, and that's how that check assembly looks like inside the body. So to disassemble it, we remove the bolts, unscrew this cap, which is a plastic piece, comes off the top, leaves this. Once the cover comes off, now I can work the check assembly out of the body, bring it out in one piece for a proper repair. So here's what the check assembly looks like outside of the body. Again, we had to remove that black plastic piece, the check cover on top. Check assembly is held in by an O-ring. There's no nuts, bolts, or screws. It's simply held in by friction as that O-ring holds it inside the body. So at this point, when the can cover off the top and that top plastic piece off, we have to get the check assembly out of the body. And it's a matter of holding this, which is our spring retainer, and we're just going to wiggle it back and forth gently like this, breaking the bond of the O-ring, moving it gently, and then the check assembly comes out of the body in one piece and looks like this. So the 2.5 through 6 is a plastic body like this, like we say. The 8 through 10 inch utilizes a bronze body, and it looks a little bit like this. This is actually one from the 4S200 series, but you've got the idea of what it looks like, and the check assembly sits like this inside the body. So putting it in the same direction as the other one was, it sits like this. And here's what the 2.5 through 6, 8 through 10 will look like this. Remember I mentioned earlier when we were looking at the pictures of the body that the straight cap on the top we saw in 2.5 through 6, and the 8 through 10 had an angled pattern, so you can see what it looks like here. We'll talk about more about this when we get to the 4S200 series. So back to this one. Now I have the check assembly out of the body. How do I get the disc out of there? Well, again, O-ring seal inside the body, so remove the O-ring, put the new one back in. But to release the spring tension on this unit, all I do is grab the top spring knob, and it unscrews. The spring is contained and stays within that spring assembly. What that allows me to do now is to get into the check assembly. By driving out this pin through here, the check assembly will come out in one piece and I can fix it. Some people like to just take the 3 bolts off like this and change it without driving that pin. You can also do it that way. Change the disc. You'll notice that the disc is not an O or a round shape, but it's a D-shaped disc. In other words, it's flat right here, and then has that rounded portion there, so it looks kind of like the letter D as in dog. Anyway, changing the disc once you've changed it, putting it back in, spring knob back in, that just needs to go in hand tight, back into the body, insert over, cover goes over the top, and then your spring knob goes on top of that check assembly. As I said, on the larger sizes, 8 through 10, it's going to be a little bit different, and it's going to look like this. So when I take the spring knob off, it'll be at this angle. Knob comes off, the spring will still be exposed. Take my cover off. Spring is not attached this time, it's separate. Check assembly sealed by an O-ring, same problem. Wiggle back and forth till you get the check out. Once you've got it out, now you can go ahead and change one nut that you see here to go ahead and change the disc. Remove my bolt here, replace the rubber disc, back together, back into the body like this, O-ring seal, shove it in. Get my spring back in. Now, where the spring sits on this one is kind of, you'll see there's a little valley right there where it has to sit, and it sits just like that at that angle. And there's that angle that we see on the cover, just like that. as opposed to the smaller sizes, which is straight up and down. And that's our 4S 100 series of double check assemblies. Same components we see in the 100, we're going to see in the 200 RP, the 600 DCDA, and the 700 RPDA. The reduced pressure principal assembly is the 4S-200 or RP series, and produced in sizes 2.5 through 10 inch. The 4S-200 production began around 2000. The 2.5 and 4 inch were discontinued right around 2003, relatively soon. Other sizes did not receive full approvals and were sold regionally around the country. So if you do have one, make sure it's approved for use in your area. But anyway, the 4S-200 series, let's take a look at that. Same basic check design as we saw in the 4S-100 series, except the relief valve, which is mounted underneath, similar as we saw in the 40 series, where the relief valve mounts underneath the check like this, high pressure side on the left, low pressure on the right, and 2.5 through 4 showing this one, and the 6 through 10 inch relief valve body over here. The check assemblies, as we saw in the 4S-100 series, very similar. All of the first checks are made of a bronze construction, where the second check on the 2.5 through 4 inch is that same plastic as in the 4S-100 series, but the majority of them will be a bronze body construction. With the heavier spring loads, they had to go to the brass material for a more sturdy check mechanism. The relief valve, as I said, mounts underneath the check body like this, and they had two different sizes, the 2.5 through 6 inch, and the relief body stayed attached to the body for the average repair, removing the relief valve cover, exposed the relief valve diaphragm, the stem assembly, which came out in one piece, seat which screwed into the body, did not have to be replaced for the average repair. This relief valve that was utilized in this is very similar to what was used in the 40-200 series. This is the 2.5 through 6. The 8 through 10 was a little bit different in size and larger, and had a couple little changes, but very similar to the 2.5 through 6 inch. But almost the exact same relief valve that was used in the 40-200 series. So let's go ahead and take the 4S series apart and see what it looks like inside. Checks we're not going to talk about since we just talked about those in the 40-100 series, but here's the relief valve of the 4S-100 series. Here's the relief valve of the 4S-200 series. So go ahead and remove the body from underneath. Cover comes off. Relief valve diaphragm, relief valve stem. Should look pretty familiar as we've seen before. That same basic relief valve stem assembly that we saw in the 40-200 series is used in the 4S-200 series. Very good and reliable relief valve, been very popular with them, and they've kept it. Relief valve seat is the glass-filled Narell instead of brass like we saw in the 40-200 series. And reassembling is going to be just the reverse. We've taken the stem apart, no reason to do it again. And that's our 4S-200 series of RP. The next conbraco series we're going to discuss is the 4V, is in Victor size, series, which is a pressure vacuum breaker, the 4V500. Same thing, different model number for each size. Same suffix numbers on the end denoting shutoff types with their ball valves with unions or regular, that type of a thing. But anyway, this is a pressure vacuum breaker. The thing that was unique about it is it had a freeze-resistant feature, which means that basically that it had a relief valve built into the air inlet, so that if the assembly was susceptible to freezing, that the relief valve would kick open and release the higher pressures from a freezing condition, hopefully so it didn't damage the assembly. The 1/2 through 1.5 inch size looked like this. Check assembly was modular, and the check assembly actually threaded into the check body. One piece here. The bonnet assembly was also one piece. The air inlet and the bonnet were attached in one piece, not field repairable. You'd buy the entire bonnet, the entire check assembly when you rebuilt this unit. The 2 inch was slightly different. It did have a rebuildable check feature where the check assembly would have a disc holder design. But the air inlets on all of them were sealed at the factory and had that relief valve in it for freeze protection. Let's take a look at the 4V series of pressure vacuum breaker. So here's our cutaway. Just like with the 40 series PVB, we've got our canopy on the top, which is very important to the working of this valve. Make sure it's there. And just as importantly, put back on when you're done repairing it. Now the bonnet looks a lot different. Remember in the 40-500 series, the bonnet was brass. Well, this is a plastic, which of itself is not the main difference to note. But what's different about this one is that at the top of the air inlet spring retainer, there's a small little relief valve. And that was installed so to give freeze protection relief on this particular assembly. When a PVB would freeze, the function of this little relief valve in the top of the poppet, which I'll show you in just a second when I take it apart, made it so that if the body froze, excess pressure push up on here, generating the little freeze plug to go on the top here where it would relieve out pressure so that it wouldn't freeze, rupturing the body. Rupturing something like plastic would be better off than the body itself. Anyway, so there is a freeze protection. Bonnet assembly would unscrew from the top. When the bonnet came off, O-ring sealed. The bonnet came off in one piece. So the repair of this air inlet assembly was to replace the entire air inlet like this. Check assembly was a little different. We don't have that little retainer like we saw in the 40-500 series. What we've got is a small check assembly that comes out in one cartridge like this. And just like with the 4S100 series, we have these small little ears on the edge of that disc holder. And these small little ears right here are very important to how this works, because the check assembly has to be put down into place, pressed in, and it's twisted to make sure that it's in place. But just as importantly, when you go to unscrew it out of the body, as you'll notice on the blue one here, I can't pull it up. That's because those little ears right here are holding it in place. So to remove it from the body, you have to unscrew it. And what happens is those ears unscrew out, allows you to bring the check assembly out in one piece. Again, replacing the entire check module. On the 2-inch size, the check module is repairable. On the 1/2 through 1.5 inches, it is not. New check assembly in place, new bonnet assembly here. Canopy back on top. That's our Conbraco 4V500 series pressure vacuum breaker with freeze protection.